we heard about scores and people complaining about scores and that they were difficult to understand, that they weren't explainable. Tell me why. All these other companies, they use this vendor. Why can they use them, but you say it's high or extreme risk, right? Just because a vendor is extreme risk or high risk doesn't mean it's a bad choice for a company.
What do you see as the biggest, most common mistake that security leaders are making these days?
I think the biggest mistake that I see is to essentially sell themselves short on what's actually possible. And there's so much more ability to do something about risk. Now, you're not going to prevent third-party breaches. They're going to happen.
Today's session is called Inside the Vendor Risk Score, extra emphasis on inside. If you've ever looked at a vendor risk score and wondered how it actually gets calculated, what's driving it, and whether you can trust it, that's exactly why we're here today. We're going to kick this session off with our head of product, Gillian, who's going to dive into a well-designed risk model. Then Nikki, our head of strategic accounts, will lead a Q&A session with Paul, our co-founder and chief customer officer, and go through practical questions around how to apply this to your everyday life. And now, without further ado, Jill, the floor is yours.
All right. Hello, everybody. I am super psyched to be delivering this content this morning. The risk model and how it works is something I'm particularly passionate about and proud of here at VISO Trust. As Allison mentioned, I'm the head of product. And my goal today is to keep it simple, but also give you a comprehensive understanding of how VISO Trust really works and why we are different than some of the other tools that are out there, and specifically focused on how we calculate risk. So let's get into the next slide. Before we jump too much into the model, I want to first take a second on the problem. Why is third-party risk so hard to measure? This is a bit of a rhetorical question, I suppose. But you know, there's a lot of programs out there that collect certifications, that collect questionnaires, and you know that is a flavor of program for sure. But I would argue that collecting documents isn't the same thing as measuring risk, and having a sort of methodology around how we think about risk, how we measure risk, how we use it to compare apples and oranges, different flavors of vendors in a systematized way is actually can be kind of tricky. So, you know, I think there's a couple things that make that traditional or let's say collecting certifications, collecting a questionnaire and getting sort of an overall like summary of how many questions were answered, for instance, problems with that approach. So first of all, as we all know, the security posture or the security posture of a vendor can collapse or change in an instant. Breaches happen. That's a fact. And a vendor that looked secure, like they had everything together, can be compromised, and you need to be able to handle that. And I would say, secondly, documents themselves don't necessarily reflect reality. And I think that is an attribute of this problem that we need to design around when thinking about how to measure risk. This is the money slide. Risk is impact times likelihood. So if a vendor was breached, how bad would this breach be? That's impact. And how likely is it for an incident to happen? So, you know, when we collapse both of these dimensions into one score, I think we miss some of the nuance and granularity that's actually really helpful for defending yourself and your organization against the risk that your third parties pose. So let's talk about the next slide here. This is a really important point on the VISO Trust platform. It's something that we call assurance. So simply put, a vendor saying that they encrypt data at rest is not the same as, for instance, a SOC 2 proving that they do in a way that is robust and reliable. And you know, something else we like to say at VISO is not all SOC 2s are created equally. The actual kind of meaning inside of an independently verified result, or independently verified audit report or assessment of some kind, there's also a range of assurance in terms of how much we can believe what a vendor tells us. So this is actually such a huge point in our risk model, because ultimately what actually moves the risk score is often assurance, right? So, has the evidence that we're looking for been independently verified, and can we stand behind it when actually reducing the likelihood score that we set up for inherent risk? I'm going to use 2 example vendors to explain the risk model. So hopefully this will you can kind of imagine example vendors in your own organization. Just for the sake of illustration, we've simplified a few things here. We're going to call one of these vendors Acme Co. It's a marketing SaaS vendor. We're going to call the other one Bridge Payments, and it's a payment processor. And they have very different purposes in your organization. And you'll see why, using the same framework, they have very different risk scores. So let's go to the next slide and talk about impact. So if a breach happened, how bad would it be? Impact is driven by the data that you're sharing. And you can generalize this to other dimensions. We're talking specifically about data loss as an impact vector here, but you could imagine operational downtime or another impact vector being used to model a different type of risk. But we're talking specifically about data loss risk here. So impact is data loss in our risk model. So, in our example vendors here, Acme Co. is sharing anonymized marketing data, marketing pixels to track user visits. So this vendor has maybe low sensitivity data. It's not public data necessarily, but it is low sensitivity in the case of a breach. For Bridge Payments, though, is sharing authentication credentials. It has access to your wire transfer infrastructure, and it is critically important to the uptime of your business. So the actual data that Bridge Payments is handling is highly sensitive and would be extremely impactful in the event of a breach. And so in our platform, this is a number. We measure impact on a scale, and this is sort of an aside, but you have the ability to customize this according to your data classification at your organization. So what is low impact to one organization may be very low impact to another, or medium impact, depending on the sort of compliance and regulatory environment that you're operating in. Okay, let's go to the next slide and talk about likelihood. So hopefully impact is relatively straightforward. What is the data that you're sharing? Likelihood, how exposed is this relationship? So in the case of Acme, it's a software supplier and it has data access. On Bridge Payments, it's a software supplier, it has data access, it has network access, it is an AI product, and it is operationally critical. So these check marks are corresponding to, in our tool, we've got an intake questionnaire. And what you check off in terms of the context of this relationship, how you're doing business, gets mapped to a set of controls in your framework. And so in Acme Co.'s case, the software supplier and data access business cases will map to 6 of our 30 controls. So you can think of this as threat surface or attack surface. Based on the way I'm doing business with Acme Co., what are the controls that I would need to have in place to appropriately defend against that attack surface should somebody compromise this vendor? And in Bridge Payments case, for the sake of this example, let's say all of the controls are in scope. So 30 out of 30 controls in our framework are in scope. And those little yellow boxes are meant to show whether a control is in scope or not. So you can see visually, these are very different in terms of exposure. All right, let's go to the next slide. So putting this together, if inherent risk, so that is the risk before we consider any of the vendor's documentation, before we look at whether they actually have compensating controls, or the vendor has mitigations with controls in place for their organization. just how you're doing business with this vendor, the nature of the relationship, how risky would this relationship be if there were no security controls in place? All right. So if we think risk equals impact times likelihood, we take our impact, we multiply it by likelihood. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the nuance in this likelihood number in a minute when it comes to residual risk. So our exposure is 6 out of 30, and we get a low inherent risk rating. Now, in the platform behind the scenes, these are numbers. And another customization we afford on our platform is the ability to decide, okay, what is the number that defines the low cutoff? What is the number that defines the medium cutoff for risk, and so on and so forth. But it's essentially a spectrum. Impact times likelihood equals risk. Okay, let's move to the next slide. So this is the other example, bridge payments. They've got a really high impact, and they've got full likelihood of all of the controls in our framework, which makes them an extremely risky vendor from an inherent risk perspective. All right, let's go to the next slide. So when we talk about residual risk, of course, and I'm probably, you all on this call probably are like very well acquainted with these concepts. So this isn't exactly rocket science here, but the nuance for how we actually calculate this is really where the important points that I hope you take away from this presentation. So residual risk is impact times likelihood after we consider all the mitigating controls. So how do we think about likelihood after mitigating controls? So on our platform, there are 3 factors here that we look for. And we talked about one of these already, which is the furthest to the right, assurance. So first of all, influence. Just like all evidence is not created equally, all controls aren't created equally. And so you've got the ability to, in our framework, we've got controls that have a higher influence and ones that have a lower influence. And so this is a weight, a multiplier for that control to say how important it is. Presence is the control in place. And so this is what we will look at the evidence and weigh it against the requirements of that control as stated. Can we consider this control to be present or not? And then lastly, assurance. How credible is this evidence? And so this starts with, okay, what artifact or where did we get this information? Did someone just attest to it? Did a vendor answer a questionnaire and tell us that, yes, they have encryption at rest in place? Or is it in a verified third-party audit? So that the actual artifact itself is the first part of this. But just like not all artifacts are created equally, not all SOC 2s are created equally, for instance. So one real-life example of how we come up with assurance here is actually looking for the test. So just because a control is mentioned in a third-party audit doesn't actually mean it was tested. So we may give sort of a good amount of assurance to a control that an auditor might have described or witnessed in a SOC 2 audit, but they didn't actually test it. And so we give even more assurance for controls that are actually tested. And we go through control by control and verify the presence of a test in order to give a control the maximum assurance. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So if we go back to our example of marketing SaaS vendor Acme Co. So our impact is the same. We're still sharing the same kind of data. And we had those 6 controls that we were looking for. 3 of those 6 controls we find evidence for. So they still have 3 controls that are missing. So we are discounting that likelihood score, and their previous residual risk rating was already low. Our previous inherent risk rating was already low. The residual risk has been burned down a little bit, but not all of the way that it could be, because they still have some controls that they haven't demonstrated. And I didn't include here all of the control weights and assurance, but that's baked into the likelihood number. So the amount that you can burn that down, if you find evidence for all the controls, but it's in a questionnaire, you're not able to burn that likelihood down as low as you can for this vendor in our risk model, because it is not a high assurance artifact. We give that a discounted assurance score. And so if, let's say, a vendor has given you that questionnaire with all the answers, and then they subsequently provide you their SOC 2 audit that has most of those controls in scope, you're going to see us giving you credit for more of those controls to further reduce your likelihood and therefore further reduce your residual risk. So similarly, here's an example showing how, let's say, bridge payments, our impact is the same because we are sharing that data. This doesn't change when we're calculating inherent and residual risk, but our likelihood, we found 15 of 30 of the controls that are in scope for this relationship being present. And our output inherent risk ends up being high for the sake of this example. Let's go to the next slide. So, this is a visualization that is a common way of looking at risk. So the actual value in the squares is the risk level, and the two axes are likelihood and impact. Okay, so for example, this Acme Co vendor here is the gray icon. They started out with a low inherent risk, and we burned down to a low residual risk. Okay, so you can actually visualize this by seeing the likelihood being reduced. And then on the bridge payment side, this is an extreme risk vendor that the likelihood went all the way down to high. But you can see that it's not possible to get a vendor like this down to low based on how the risk model works. So this helps you visualize, like, what is the lowest possible risk that this vendor could, the lowest possible risk that our risk model would output for this vendor. Now, a couple other like nuanced points for anyone who is wondering about these details. We do allow you to override the risk. Let's say in the case of you having compensating controls in your organization, some reason why it actually shouldn't be medium, it should be low because of X, Y, and Z of how you're doing business with this organization. Let's go to the last slide, and we can kind of sum up and get into our Q&A. What does good look like for a third-party risk management program? And in our perspective, this is really doing four things, right? It's applying consistent inputs so our scores are comparable. It's weighing controls by influence. It's requiring real evidence, not just questionnaires and like summing up the answer and taking that for granted. And it's also monitoring continuously, because we know that your posture, your risk posture with your third-party risk management program can change in a matter of minutes. And our approach, we feel strongly that modeling inherent risk in this way and really taking stock of the nature of your business relationship, the data being shared, helps you to react the most appropriately in the event of a breach. Yeah. So that's all I had in terms of the content. I think we can switch over to our Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you, Jill. Really good chatter in the chat. We love that. So hi, Jason. We have such a good mix of current customers and prospective customers. So love seeing the activity over there. My name is Nikki, head of strategic accounts here. So excited to ask a few questions to Paul. We only have 10 minutes. And when Paul and I get talking, we could probably talk for the next hour. So if we go over a few minutes, that might happen. So if you can hang out with us, please feel free. But yeah, let's get into it. So Jill, thank you so much for walking us through the model and kind of the mathematics and the formula of it all. But Paul, what I'd love to transition to is getting a better understanding of how the model actually plays out in decision making in a practitioner's day-to-day in the business. So maybe you can talk us through that a little bit.
Okay. Well, that's a great question, Nikki. And I also wanted to say just briefly, Jill, thank you for that presentation. That was wonderful. I think the most important thing about why we've built it this way is to make it pragmatic, to make it actionable, for that risk score to play out in a very, very usable way. And what we've gone after there is consistency, standardization, putting you in the position to really operate from a position of governance. And we heard for many years before building VISO, we heard about scores and people complaining about scores and that they were difficult to understand, that they weren't explainable, and that it was very difficult to validate them and to make them usable. And so the focus for us is really using the score to make life easier for customers, make it easier for them to make clear decisions and then explain those decisions to their business stakeholders. So how the way we see that play out in daily life is that the pragmatic score allows you to easily measure a very large number of vendors with very little or no effort, easily see where you want to focus additional efforts, and then focus those efforts in a very highly automated way. And I think one of the things that I'd like to point out, that I thought about while watching the presentation is, we've been an AI company from the start, right? Launched with an AI-based approach all the way back in 2020. And sometimes customers think that we just use AI to kind of magically come up with a score, and we really don't. The risk model is deterministic, and that's by design. While the platform is driven by dozens and dozens of expertly designed, highly sophisticated prompts, AI prompts, the risk score is and will remain deterministic. This is so it's configurable by you so that it's entirely consistent, it's entirely predictable, and the results are always meaningful results that you can stand behind.
I love that. Thank you, Paul. I want to ask specifically around residual risk and, specifically how does that residual risk help teams make real life approval decisions? After going through the process and going from inherent to residual, like how do you see that being used in actual business decisions?
Yeah. Yeah. So this varies across different customers. We've got different customers that have very different businesses. They might have differences in size and complexity. They may have very different risk tolerances, right? And so, we have customers that have been able to use the platform to shift this process left, look at all vendors at the RFP, RFI stage, and essentially provide data as a service very, very quickly to their buyers, their software buyers, their business owners, and really use that residual risk rating to enable business owners to make better selection decisions about vendors, thereby really getting kind of the maximum risk value or ROI on risk in the process. Now we have on the other side of the spectrum, we've got customers that they advise the business, they catalog information, they look at a higher level, often at aggregated data, but they aren't necessarily involved in that decision, right? They're monitoring risk, they're reporting on risk, but they may or may not really influence the decision. And for them, we offer speed, we offer scale, we offer accuracy, and the ability for them to report to leadership on aggregate risk and help selectively to drive the business in a different direction based on the risk that they see. So it really varies significantly, but we've built the platform to really focus on being able to address the diversity that exists in different companies' TPRM programs.
So on that same kind of residual risk vein, great question from Jason at Lowe's. Hi, Jason. So what's the most common question that executives ask when we're providing, as a security team, we're providing that residual risk score of a vendor? Where do you see, like, when executives are kind of certain, and as an executive now, you have a very unique perspective on this, Paul, like, what do we need to show them? What are they asking of us? Like, how does that interaction go?
Yeah. So first, if it ever has anything, it depends on your tolerance, right? But anything above medium, typically, high or extreme, like what's behind that score, right? I don't believe it. Tell me why. All these other companies, they use this vendor. Why can they use them, but you say it's high or extreme risk, right? So they need to understand why. And that's the most important thing. The next thing is going to be, what does it mean for my business, right? What does this really mean for our business goals, what we're trying to achieve? And just because a vendor is extreme risk or high risk doesn't mean it's a bad choice for a company, right? There may be, incredible opportunities on the other side of that choice where the opportunity outweighs the risk, right? And that's a business decision. That's why we have our boards, our executive leadership to determine those priorities and make those decisions. And it's our responsibility as governance professionals to give them all the information that they need to make highly accurate and qualified decisions that way. But yeah, they're going to need to know what's behind it. They're going to need to know why, and they're going to need to know what it means for their business.
Yeah, all things that they can get directly from VISO, conveniently.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That assessment summary, you're going to see what controls are missing. You're going to see where there wasn't enough assurance. You're going to understand, based on the nature of the business relationship, the type of data that's being shared, etc., why it matters, right?
All right, so time for maybe one final question, and I love this one. If a security team could change one thing about their vendor risk program tomorrow, what should it be?
Goodness, if they could change one thing, accuracy at scale.
Yeah.
I I know I kind of hit two things in there, Nikki, but
That's okay. We'll take it. Can you expand on that for a couple minutes?
yeah. I think so. The one of the biggest things is, do you have visibility? Do you see your entire population? Do you have at your fingertips that fourth party landscape? So that's kind of the scale aspect. I really need to know something about every relationship, right?
Yeah.
And that's so important. And then with the information that I get back from the entire process, right? From everything from my initial inherent risk determinations, and my understanding of what companies do and how we're using them, all the way down to that deep residual risk analysis where I've got exactly what the shortcomings are and how they might impact my business. You need that stuff to be highly transparent. You need it to be highly accurate. You need it to be highly actionable and pragmatic according to your risk tolerance, your business, and your ability to take action to reduce risk.
All right, I love it. We actually have 3 more minutes, so I'm gonna throw you a dramatic question, okay? What do you see as the biggest, like most common mistake that security leaders are making in running their TPRM programs these days?
I think the biggest mistake that I see security teams make is to essentially sell themselves short on what's actually possible, right? There's been limitations over the past 20 years in this space that have made it very, very, very hard to get real value from third-party risk management historically, right? And these are situations where it just couldn't scale. You couldn't get enough information from vendors. And people had to rely on highly manual questionnaire-based processes, or easy to get ratings, and they just accepted that these things don't really deliver value, and they just said, okay, we're going to check the box. And right now, there's so much more risk, and there's so much more ability to do something about risk. Now, you're not going to prevent third-party breaches; they're going to happen. But you can certainly make yourself much more prepared, and you can certainly reduce the frequency of them and the impact of them. And with the technology that's available today and available on the VISO Trust platform, you can do this at scale in a really meaningful way, and you can transform your business in the process and accelerate that business mission, whatever it is.
Thank you guys so much for coming. This was amazing. We did record today, so we'll send it out to everyone. Really, everyone joining, your involvement in our community, what we're building, it really is something that just makes VISO so special and enjoyable. And all of your feedback is so incredibly valuable. So thank you guys all for coming. And let's do it again soon. Sound good? All right.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.